Paris in the 1920s was a city transformed by war and intoxicated by freedom. The Great War had ended, leaving behind a generation scarred by violence and desperate for escape. The French capital, which had survived 4 years of conflict, now burst into life with a manic energy that would define the entire decade. While the world remembers the jazz clubs, the fashion revolution, and the artistic movements that flourished during these Années Folles, or crazy years, there existed a darker undercurrent that flowed through the city's veins like poison in paradise. This was the era when heroin, morphine, cocaine, and opium transformed from medicines into the intoxicants of choice for everyone, from high society to the desperate poor, creating a drug culture that would forever change Paris and influence the world's approach to narcotics. Before we can understand the heroin craze that gripped 1920s Paris, we must step back to the late 19th century, when the phenomenon of drug addiction first emerged as a recognized social problem in France. The medical community had initially embraced morphine as a wonder drug. After its isolation from opium in the early 1800s and the invention of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s, morphine became the painkiller of choice for doctors treating everything from battlefield wounds to chronic pain. It was clean, it was modern, it was scientific. What could possibly go wrong? By the 1870s, doctors began noticing something disturbing. Patients who had been treated with morphine were returning, not because their original ailment had worsened, but because they needed more of the drug. They were physically and emotionally dependent. The medical establishment gave this frightening new phenomenon a name: morphinomany, or morphine addiction. The term itself reveals the panic and misunderstanding of the time. These weren't people with a medical condition that could be treated. They were maniacs, possessed by an uncontrollable craving. The medical response to morphine addiction seems almost comical in hindsight, though its consequences were anything but funny. Doctors reasoned that if patients were addicted to morphine, perhaps they could be weaned off it using a different substance. Enter cocaine and heroin. Yes, physicians actually prescribed these drugs as cures for morphine addiction. Heroin, synthesized by the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in 1898, was initially marketed as a non-addictive alternative to morphine and even as a cure for morphine addiction. The name itself came from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic or powerful, because of its dramatic effects. Bayer launched an aggressive marketing campaign, promoting heroin as a cough suppressant and selling it as a wonder drug that could treat everything from tuberculosis to asthma. Within just a few years, the truth became horrifyingly apparent. These substitution therapies were far more dangerous than morphine itself. Soon the phenomenon of morphinomany grew into an entire lexicon of addictive manias. There was cocaine mania, opium mania, hashish mania, and heroin mania. By the early 1900s, all of these were unified under the umbrella term toxicomany, or drug addiction. Despite the different properties and effects of these substances, both medical and popular discourse grouped them into the same dangerous category, endowing them all with the same sinister character. By the 1880s, doctors were beginning to condemn these drugs as agents of degeneration, capable of wreaking chaos on both the individual and social body if allowed to spread. This was the age of theories about racial degeneration, and drug abuse fit perfectly into these fears. Drugs were seen as both a sign and a catalyst of medical and social decay. If allowed to spread unchecked, drug abuse would facilitate the physical and moral decline of the nation itself. Despite the medical cries of alarm, morphine broke out of the doctor's office and took hold as a recreational drug in select Paris salons. The upper classes, with their money and leisure time, began experimenting with these exotic substances as a form of entertainment and sophistication. Yet legislators largely ignored the problem. Why? The number of drug addicts remained relatively small, confined mostly to the wealthy and artistic classes who could afford these expensive habits. As long as drug use was a problem of the elite, it remained on the legislative back burner. The authorities were more concerned with maintaining order among the masses than policing the private vices of the rich. But there was one group whose drug use could not be ignored: the military. The drug of choice within the French armed forces was opium, which sailors and officers had discovered in the opium dens of French Indochina. These men brought the habit back to French soil, establishing private opium dens in naval port cities like Brest and Toulon. Prostitutes quickly realized there was money to be made catering to this new vice, setting up establishments where sailors, officers, and military administrators gathered for late-night opium-smoking sessions. The prospect of an addicted military was far more alarming to authorities than any number of wealthy socialites ruining themselves with morphine. The military was the backbone of national defense and the symbol of French strength. An army weakened by drugs was unthinkable. Everything changed when war came in 1914. The outbreak of World War I transformed the drug problem from a minor social concern into a matter of national security. Paranoia gripped France as fears spread that enemy powers, particularly Germany, would encourage the decay of French morale through drugs. These fears were not entirely unfounded. After all, German pharmaceutical companies like Merck and Bayer were among Europe's leading producers of morphine, heroin, and cocaine. Why wouldn't the Germans use their pharmacological expertise to wage a covert form of chemical warfare against France? The government responded with draconian measures. Using an 1849 law concerning governance during a siege, the state gained the right to expel anyone considered a dangerous individual from regions where battles were fought or military operations staged. Initially, this policy targeted foreigners of German and Austrian descent, forcing them into camps that were part displaced persons facility, part prison. But foreigners weren't the only ones expelled. Anti-militarists were removed from war zones, as were prostitutes rumoured to be spreading venereal disease or drugs. And critically, known drug addicts were forcibly removed from areas near the front lines. The message was clear. Drug use was not merely a personal failing, but a form of treason, a betrayal of national solidarity. This hardline approach continued after the war ended in 1918, but the Paris that emerged from the Great War was a city transformed, and the forces that had been unleashed by 4 years of industrialized slaughter could not simply be bottled up again. The 1920s began with France attempting to rebuild both its physical infrastructure and its shattered society. But the generation that had survived the trenches returned home with profound psychological scars. They had seen their friends die in unspeakable ways. They had lived with constant fear, deprivation, and violence. Many had been introduced to morphine in military hospitals, where it was liberally administered to treat horrific wounds. These men came home addicted, traumatized, and desperate for anything that could help them forget. At the same time, the war had disrupted traditional social structures and moral codes. Women who had worked in factories during the war were not content to return to domestic servitude. Traditional notions of propriety and behavior seemed absurd to a generation that had stared death in the face. If life was short and could end violently at any moment, why not seize pleasure wherever it could be found? This was the psychological landscape of post-war Paris, and it created the perfect conditions for the drug culture that would flourish in the 1920s. Montmartre, the Bohemian hilltop neighbourhood crowned by the Sacré-Cœur Basilica, became the epicenter of Parisian drug culture. This was where the artistic and criminal worlds intersected, where painters and poets mixed with criminals and prostitutes, where the boundaries between respectability and vice dissolved in clouds of opium smoke and cocaine dust. The narrow, winding streets of Montmartre hid countless secrets. Behind unmarked doors and down hidden staircases, opium dens operated openly enough that those in the know could find them, but discreetly enough to avoid immediate police attention. While opium dens had the romantic, exotic appeal of the Orient, the drug scene of 1920s Paris was increasingly dominated by more modern intoxicants. Cocaine became wildly fashionable in the immediate aftermath of the war. It was the drug of speed and modernity, perfect for the frenetic pace of 1920s nightlife. Unlike opium, which required time and ritual to prepare and smoke, cocaine could be snorted quickly in a nightclub bathroom between dances. It was energizing rather than sedating, allowing users to party all night without fatigue. Most importantly, it was chic, sophisticated, and distinctly modern. Heroin, meanwhile, was gaining ground among those seeking more intense experiences. Though Bayer had stopped producing it commercially after the dangers became clear, clandestine production was ramping up. Heroin was more potent than morphine, more concentrated, and easier to transport and conceal. It could be injected for maximum effect or snorted for a slower onset. By the mid-1920s, heroin was becoming the drug of choice for serious users, those who had moved beyond recreational dabbling into full-blown addiction. The social geography of drug use in 1920s Paris was complex and stratified. At the top of the hierarchy were the wealthy elites and artistic luminaries who could afford to maintain expensive habits while still functioning in society. These were the people who attended fashionable salons where drugs were consumed as casually as champagne. Writers like Jean Cocteau, Pierre Drieux-La Rochelle, and Elisabeth de Gramont documented this world in their memoirs and novels, describing a mundane Paris that didn't disdain indulging in intoxicants. For these social elites, drugs were pleasures that expressed a certain Parisian identity, rebellious, nonchalant, eager for novelty, and disdainful of common pleasures. Opium retained a special cachet among this set. It was the drug of distinction par excellence, even though its popularity was declining. The ritual of opium smoking, with its specialized equipment and time-consuming preparation, suggested leisure and sophistication. You couldn't simply snort opium in a bathroom stall. You needed a proper setting, the right equipment, and hours to devote to the experience. This made it the preserve of those with both money and time. Jean Cocteau was perhaps the most famous opium devotee of 1920s Paris. A poet, playwright, filmmaker, and artist, Cocteau was at the center of Parisian cultural life. He began using opium in his early 30s, devastated by the death in 1923 of his young protégé, the writer Raymond Radiguet. What started as a means of coping with grief became a lifelong addiction, though Cocteau made periodic attempts to quit, checking himself into sanatoriums to detox. He documented these experiences in his book Opium. Diary of a Cure, published in 1930, which included his own drawings of human figures transformed into opium pipes. Cocteau never exceeded 10 pipes a day, he claimed, believing he was reducing his chances of addiction through moderation. He was wrong. Cocteau moved in circles that included many of the 20th century's most famous artists. Pablo Picasso, who had experimented with opium in his youth, was a friend. The two would later reminisce fondly about their opium-smoking days. The Chilean diplomat Anthony de Gandarillas, who partied with London's bright young people, began smoking opium around the same time as Cocteau. Kit Wood, an English painter and Gandarillas's companion, was another opium enthusiast. These men and their circles represented a transnational Bohemian elite for whom drugs were part of a broader rebellion against conventional society and conventional art. The artistic community embraced drug use as a path to creative inspiration and altered consciousness. The Surrealists, who came to prominence in the 1920s, were particularly interested in exploring altered states. André Masson experimented with automatic drawing while under the influence of opium, believing it helped him access unconscious creative impulses. André Breton's Surrealist Manifesto of 1924 explicitly referenced opium, writing that surrealist images came spontaneously, just as opium images did, without conscious evocation. The playwright and poet Antonin Artaud was an outspoken advocate for drug use, attacking those who sought to criminalize narcotics. When anti-drug crusaders called for criminalizing cocaine in 1925, Artaud responded with a passionate defense, arguing that society had no right to prevent people from cleansing themselves of sorrow through drugs. But the artistic justifications for drug use obscured a grimmer reality. Below the glamorous surface of Bohemian Paris, a much darker drug culture was taking root. In the nightclubs, dancings, and bars that proliferated in 1920s Paris, drugs circulated as a routine part of nightlife. The world of prostitution was particularly intertwined with the drug trade. Sex workers used cocaine, morphine, and heroin as both aphrodisiacs and escapes from the harsh realities of their lives. Many were supplied by dealer pimps who used addiction as a means of control, ensuring the women remained dependent and compliant. Montmartre was notorious as the centre of this trade. The police files and newspaper accounts of the era are filled with references to the Butte, as locals called Montmartre, as a hotbed of drug trafficking. Unlike Montparnasse, the other major Bohemian quarter of Paris, Montmartre had a well-developed commercial infrastructure for drug distribution. Dealers operated with relative impunity, protected by corrupt officials and the complex geography of the neighbourhood's winding streets and hidden courtyards. The drugs themselves reflected the character of the city. In Marseille, France's southern port city, drug use was characterised by what authorities called ethnic drugs: opium brought by Chinese sailors, hashish used by North African immigrants. In Paris, by contrast, the preference was for hard drugs, cocaine, morphine, and heroin. These were drugs that electrified the brain, that could be consumed quickly to fit the frenetic pace of urban nightlife. The slow, meditative ritual of opium smoking seemed almost quaint by comparison. A quick snort of cocaine or injection of heroin was better suited to the trepidations of Parisian professional and social life. The international dimension of the drug trade was crucial to Paris's role as a drug capital. The city was a hub in global trafficking networks that were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Turkish poppies were harvested and processed into raw opium, which was shipped to Marseille. There, laboratories converted it into morphine and heroin. From Marseille, the drugs moved to Paris, where they were distributed to users and dealers. Paris also served as a transit point for drugs heading to other European cities and across the Atlantic to North America. This was the early version of what would later be called the French Connection, the heroin pipeline that would dominate international drug trafficking for decades. The case of Gerald Edward Mary O'Brien illustrates how these networks operated. In July 1937, O'Brien was arrested at Dieppe Harbour, returning from France with 6 grams of high-quality heroin concealed on his person. He had bought the drugs from 2 young Americans living in a hotel in Pigalle, Montmartre's entertainment and vice district. This was just one of many trips O'Brien had made, ferrying drugs between Paris and London. The transaction was a small part of a vast network overseen by Corsican and Sicilian organised crime groups. O'Brien's story is fascinating because it shows how drug culture transcended national boundaries. Born Irish, raised in East London, he had qualified as a chartered accountant but found the profession boring. He was drawn instead to the nightlife of London's West End, where he ran unlicensed nightclubs featuring drinking, dancing, gambling, and drug use. He shared a flat with Bella Gold, a dancer and nightclub hostess who was arrested shortly after O'Brien and charged with possession of heroin, cocaine, and hashish. Both O'Brien and Gold made regular trips to Paris on the boat train, bringing back supplies. Gold also ordered drugs through the post, receiving packages from Paris that she distributed to other users and dealers. The connection between London and Paris was crucial to the drug culture of both cities. Many British users and dealers travelled to Paris to obtain supplies. Brenda Dean Paul, a member of London's Bohemian Chelsea set, wrote about her enchantment with Paris and French culture. She went there in search of what she called a mysterious underworld, and it was in Paris that she was allegedly introduced to the morphine that would dominate her short life. The Italian journalist and novelist Dino Segre, writing under the pen name Pigalle, venerated Montmartre as a venal Medusa of many poisons and innumerable filters that attracted travellers with boundless fascination. This international drug culture provoked intense anxiety among British authorities, who saw it as a threat to British identity and morals. Home Secretary J.S. Clines declared that the general moral standards of most European countries, and particularly France, were lower than those in Britain. Major William Coles, head of the Home Office Drugs Branch, contended that it was not characteristic of the British race to indulge in narcotic drugs. When a parliamentary committee examined proposals for a channel tunnel in the late 1920s, Lord Crawford testified that he was a xenophobe, particularly regarding the French, whom he viewed as a corrupt and corrupting influence. The less personal intercourse between Britain and France, he argued, the better for Britain. These attitudes reveal the cultural and moral dimensions of drug prohibition. It wasn't simply that drugs were harmful, it was that they represented foreign decadence and moral dissolution. The British governing classes were determined to defend their country from what they saw as the ravages of European modernism, with its loose morals, artistic experimentation, and casual attitudes toward intoxication. Drugs, sexuality, and artistic freedom became conflated in the minds of conservatives as a single threatening package that originated in Paris. The legal framework around drugs was evolving rapidly during the 1920s. France had passed laws in 1908 and 1916 restricting the sale and distribution of narcotics, giving drug use the added appeal of the forbidden. International conventions, particularly the Hague Convention of 1912, committed signatory nations to controlling the production and distribution of opiates and cocaine. But enforcement was inconsistent and often ineffective. Pharmaceutical companies continued to produce far more heroin than could possibly be justified by legitimate medical needs. In 1928, one French company, La Société Roesler et Compagnie, produced 35 tons of heroin, enough to satisfy the medical needs of the entire world population more than 3 times over. Where did all this excess production go? Into the illicit market, of course. The League of Nations attempted to coordinate international drug control efforts, but its power was limited. Countries were reluctant to impose restrictions that might damage their pharmaceutical industries or reduce lucrative exports. The result was a patchwork of laws and regulations that created opportunities for smuggling and diversion. Drugs that were legally manufactured in one country could be exported to another with lax controls, from which they would leak into the black market. Paris, with its central location, sophisticated financial system, and cosmopolitan population, was ideally positioned to take advantage of these gaps in international enforcement. The human cost of the heroin craze was devastating. While the wealthy and famous might manage their habits with access to pure drugs and medical care, poorer users faced a grimmer reality. Drugs sold on the street were often adulterated with dangerous substances. Users shared needles, spreading infections. Overdoses were common. The desperation of addiction drove people to crime, prostitution, and violence. Families were destroyed as addicts chose drugs over everything else. Withdrawal from opiates is a brutal experience. Users suffer intense physical and psychological agony, muscle aches, vomiting, diarrhea, insomnia, anxiety, depression. The craving for the drug becomes all-consuming, driving addicts back to using even when they desperately want to quit. This was not well understood in the 1920s. Addiction was seen as a moral failing, a weakness of character, rather than a medical condition. Addicts were criminals to be punished, not patients to be treated. This punitive approach drove users underground, making them less likely to seek help and more vulnerable to exploitation by dealers and organized crime. Women were particularly vulnerable in this environment. With few opportunities for education or employment, many desperate women turned to prostitution and from prostitution to drugs. The two industries became intertwined, with pimps often serving as dealers, using addiction as a mechanism of control. Drugs were romanticized as aphrodisiacs, but the reality was exploitation and suffering. The artistic depictions of female drug users from this era, created mostly by male artists, portrayed them as simultaneously alluring and doomed, mysterious and pathetic. These images reflected male anxieties about female sexuality and independence more than they captured any truth about women's actual experiences with drugs. The mythology surrounding drug use in 1920s Paris was as powerful as the reality. Writers, filmmakers, and artists created a romantic narrative about the drug-fueled creativity and philosophical insights that could be achieved through intoxication. This narrative would influence generations of artists and intellectuals who saw drug use as a legitimate, even noble artistic practice. Jean Cocteau's eloquent writing on opium, like Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater before him, established drug addiction as part of the artistic mystique. These weren't just writers who happened to use drugs. Their drug use became central to their artistic identities and their public personas. But this romanticization came at a terrible price. It obscured the reality of addiction and made drugs seem like a reasonable choice for those seeking artistic inspiration or escape from bourgeois convention. The American beat poets of the 1950s, including William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg, were heavily influenced by Cocteau and the Parisian drug culture of the 1920s. They saw drugs as tools for expanding consciousness and challenging what they viewed as a repressive, materialistic society. Burroughs became a heroin addict and dealer, documenting his experiences in novels like Junkie and Naked Lunch. The noble image of the poor drug-using artist took on new life, coupled with existential hunger and rebellion against capitalism. By the end of the 1920s, the party was winding down. The Great Depression began with the stock market crash of 1929, ending the era of prosperity and excess that had characterized the decade. The political situation in Europe was darkening as fascism rose in Italy and Germany. France itself was becoming more conservative and authoritarian. The tolerance for Bohemian excess that had characterized the Années Folles was evaporating. Law enforcement efforts against drugs intensified. Police crackdowns on drug dealers and users became more common and more severe. International cooperation on drug control improved, making it harder to exploit gaps between national systems. The romanticized image of the drug-using artist was increasingly challenged by the grim reality of addiction visible in hospital wards and prison cells. The damage caused by the heroin craze of the 1920s had become impossible to ignore. Yet the legacy of 1920s Paris drug culture would endure for decades. The city had established itself as a global hub for drug trafficking, a role it would maintain into the post-war era with the French Connection heroin pipeline. The artistic and literary works produced during this period continued to influence attitudes toward drugs, creativity, and consciousness for generations. The debates about drug policy that began in this era, balancing individual freedom against social harm, law enforcement against public health, continue today. The heroin craze of 1920s Paris was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a broader transformation in how society understood and related to psychoactive substances. The 19th century model, in which drugs were medicines freely available to anyone, had collapsed under the weight of addiction and social problems. But the prohibitionist model that replaced it created its own set of issues: black markets, organized crime, inconsistent enforcement, and the criminalization of addiction. We are still grappling with these problems a century later. Looking back at 1920s Paris from our present vantage point, we can see both the allure and the danger of that era. The creative explosion that characterized the Années Folles produced extraordinary art, literature, and music that still influences us today. The social liberation, particularly for women, represented real progress toward a more equitable society. The rejection of the militaristic nationalism that had caused the Great War was understandable and even admirable. But the drug culture that flourished in this environment caused immense suffering, destroyed countless lives, and established patterns of addiction and trafficking that persist to this day. The men and women who lived through the heroin craze of 1920s Paris were navigating unprecedented circumstances. They had survived a catastrophic war, lived through rapid social change, and faced an uncertain future. Some sought solace in drugs, others sought inspiration, and still others simply sought profit. Their choices created a moment in history that was simultaneously glamorous and tragic, creative and destructive, liberating and enslaving. Paris in the 1920s was a city of contradictions, and nowhere were those contradictions more visible than in its drug culture. The heroin that flowed through its streets brought both ecstasy and agony, both artistic vision and human wreckage. It was, in many ways, the perfect drug for a city and an era defined by extremes, by the collision of old and new, tradition and modernity, joy and despair. The legacy of that collision still echoes in our world today, a reminder that the pursuit of pleasure and the escape from pain can come at costs we cannot always foresee or control,